Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Melissa Siegel. I'm a professor of migration studies, and this is a channel about all things migration. So today we're going to continue with our snapshot series, our migration snapshot series, where we zoom in on a specific country, often a European Union country, and look at the migration situation in that country using the European Commission's Knowledge Center on Migration and Demography's Atlas of Migration. And today we're going to be looking at Portugal. When we're looking at Portugal, we're going to be looking at some very specific aspects. So we'll look at population of emigrants and immigrants, residence permits and visas issued. We'll look at asylum applications and even one measure of irregular migration, as well as citizenship and naturalization. We'll also look at some indicators of social inclusion, and we'll look at education and employment in the country. Now let's start by first looking at the population in the country. So here, if we look at Portugal, the population of Portugal is around 10 million people. And of that, around 4.5% are actually immigrants from a non-EU background, meaning that they have citizenship from outside of the European Union, whereas around 1.5% of the population has citizenship from within the EU. So they are EU citizens, but immigrants in Portugal. So at least if we're looking at citizenship, this means that around 6% or a little bit over 6% of the population in Portugal is not Portuguese. Now let's turn and look at annual flows of immigrants and emigrants. So immigration is when people come into a country, and emigration is when people leave a country. Of course, if you're also interested in the differences between stocks and flows, here obviously we're looking at a specific flow. The number I gave you before from 2020, looking at more than 6% of the population being non-citizens, that is a stock. And if you're interested in the difference between migrant stocks and migrant flows, you can check out my video on that here. Now let's look at the annual flows in 2018. First, let's look at immigration, or people entering the country. So we can see that around 43,000 people entered the country as immigrants in 2018. And also of this, we can see that 66% of these people were from outside of the European Union and 34% were from within the European Union. Now, if we look at the number of people leaving the country, so in 2018, 32,000 people emigrated or left Portugal. And around 68% of these people were people from outside of the European Union, and 32% were people inside of the European Union. Now we can turn our attention to residence permits. And of course, here we're looking mainly at non-EU nationals, because EU nationals generally don't need residence permits. So here we're mainly looking at people from outside of the European Union. And you can see here the different types of first residence permits that were issued between 2016 and 2019. You can see here that a decent proportion were issued because of work and family reasons, but that we also see other things like education and other reasons also for permits being issued. If we also look at just valid residence permits in total, so not specifically that were necessarily issued at that time, you can see a bigger mix of work, family, education, and then other reasons, which could be things like having refugee status or some kind of humanitarian protection. Now, speaking of humanitarian protection, let's look at asylum applications between 2017 and 2020. And what you can see here is that there are not a huge number of asylum applications that have been put in during this period. Portugal has a very different situation with regard to numbers of asylum applications compared to other countries, perhaps like Italy or Greece, at least over the same time period. What we can see, though, is that the number of people that have put in asylum, applications, the majority have been men. Again, between 2020 and 2017, we're really seeing between 1,000 and 2,000 applications put in each year, which is not really a very substantial number compared to other European countries. Of course, if you're interested in those numbers for other European countries, you can check out the other snapshots on the channel. Here, I'll also list them down in the description below. Now, if we look at asylum applications and first instance decisions, again, between 2017 and 2020, what we can see here is that particularly in 2019 and 2020, there were a large proportion of rejections that were done. Whereas in 2017 and 2018, we see that more than 50% of the claims that were put in were not rejected, mainly under the Geneva Convention or some other kind of subsidiary humanitarian protection. Now let's look at one measure of irregular migration. So what does that mean? What we're looking at here is persons who were ordered to leave the country, so people who were ordered to leave Portugal, and the actual number of people that are recorded as being returned. So here you can see between 2017 and 2020 that actually the number of people that returned after getting a decision that they could not stay was very low. Only between 5% and 15% of people that were told they no longer had the right to stay in Portugal actually left the country. And that means, of course, that the people who stayed in the country did not have the right to stay there and then ended up generally in irregularity. So these are actually very low numbers, or at least very low recorded numbers of people who actually left the country, again, compared to other European countries. Now let's look at citizenship and naturalization. And what does that mean? That means that people who have acquired the nationality in Portugal, and this usually can happen after a certain number of years and taking certain tests and meeting language requirements, etc., etc. And what do we see here? That it's like in many other European countries, it is mainly non-European citizens that are applying for and gaining citizenship. And that is because, in general, in the European Union, EU citizens have the same rights as local citizens. So there's not much of a need or a reason for them to gain citizenship compared to third country nationals. And you can see this, that in general, it's between 3 and 4% of European nationals that are gaining citizenship, and really the majority are non-EU citizens. And if we look at the share of foreign citizens who have acquired citizenship, here we can see again, of especially the non-EU nationals, anywhere between 8.5% and 6% of people who have actually gained citizenship in a given year between 2016 and 2019. Now we can turn and look at some indicators of social inclusion. And a very important and first indicator that we often look at is the median income in the country. And what we can see here is that actually EU nationals who are immigrants in Portugal have a slightly higher income than nationals, although there's not a big difference here. And immigrants coming from outside of the EU have a slightly lower income than both nationals and EU immigrants. If we look at things like overcrowding rates and risks of poverty or social exclusion and risks of poverty for children, we do see, for instance, when it comes to overcrowding, that nationals have the lowest probability or the lowest chance of being overcrowded, so having a lot of people living in a small space, whereas non-EU nationals have the highest overcrowding rates. Now, if we look at the risks of being in poverty just for adults, we actually see that non-EU immigrants have higher risks of being in poverty, but that EU mobile workers actually have a much lower risk of being in poverty, compared even to nationals. If we look at the risk of poverty for children, nationals in general have lower rates of poverty or risks of poverty for children compared to non-nationals. Now let's look at educational attainment, again broken down by nationals, EU nationals, and non-EU nationals in Portugal. And what we see here is that in general, immigrants actually have higher levels of education than nationals. So both EU immigrants and non-EU immigrants have high levels of education and higher levels of medium education than nationals in the country. And this is not the same for all countries in Europe. Sometimes we see a different mix, particularly for both EU mobile workers and for non-EU workers. But here we see very highly educated immigrants in Portugal. Now, if we look at the employment rates here, what we can see is that there are not very large differences in employment rates between European nationals and non-European nationals and the national population. So what you can see here, especially if we look at the age group between 25 and 49, that amongst men, the numbers are all very similar, with EU immigrants having slightly higher employment rates. If we look at women, though, the picture looks a little bit different, with nationals having the highest employment rates and non-EU immigrants having lower employment rates. Now, if we look at employment by education level, we actually see, particularly with medium and high levels of education, that here European immigrants really stand out as having higher rates of employment in these different educational levels, whereas the nationals in some cases look more similar to the non-EU immigrants. But what we see here in general is that EU immigrants are really kind of overperforming compared to the other groups. Now, I hope this snapshot just gave you a quick look at the immigration and emigration situation in Portugal today. Again, if you're interested in other countries, please do check out the snapshots here. I'll link them in the description below. And if you like this video, of course, please give it a thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of my videos that I upload every week. And I do hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.